I remember the
Well, I'm going to try it for the third time to do Jerome, Aumente, and Doug Eldridge, and Andy Baglivo, and Bill Gordon to come up here. We're thrilled that so many of you came out tonight. This is quite a gathering of former Newark News journalists and former readers of the Newark News. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of the Newark History Society and the Newark Public Library.
Say it again.
We're co-sponsoring this event. The Newark History Society was founded how many years ago now, Maureen? 5, 6, 7 years ago. 8.5. Time flies. And it is our goal to provide a forum for discussion in issues relating to Newark history, also to encourage further research into topics of Newark history. And if you wish to be on our mailing list, we host 5 or 6 programs a year. Please sign the paper in the middle. There's a piece of paper on each table. And we'll be happy to add you to our mailing list. And one person has already mentioned his dues tonight. To me, if others of you brought you $25, feel free to give that to me as well.
Yes.
And I think one of our most difficult tasks is breaking up conversations here, so we can get started. There's a lot of memorabilia and old photographs.
Could we have silence in the room, please?
But tonight's program allows us to touch both bases. One is to discuss the influence and the impact of the Newark Evening News on Newark and New Jersey. The period leading up to its closing in 1972. We have a very fine panel with us tonight. We're going to start with an overview from Jerome, who is a distinguished professor emeritus at the Rutgers School of Journalism, the author of a new book on From Econ Paper to the Internet, Past Challenges and Future Transformations for New Jersey's Newspapers. And this is going to be for sale at the table down at the end afterwards. We also have Andy Baglivo, Doug Eldridge, and Bill Gordon, all former Newark News journalists. We've helped Doug reprint copies of his article from New Jersey history back in 1986, which he called The Rise and Fall of the Newark News, A Personal Perspective. And we printed 100 copies, Doug, and I'm not sure whether that's going to be enough. So if we can do one per family, and pick it up here at the table at the end. It has a foreword by John Cunningham, and we're pleased that he's with us here tonight as well. The other reason for doing this program, and this is the 125th anniversary this year of the founding of the Newark News, but it's also a way of bringing attention to and marking the effort to bring the war the clippings file of the Newark News that was saved by John Cunningham and Charles Cummings that has now been completely microfilmed. Between 2 and 3 million clippings have been microfilmed. The index to these clippings, it will soon be online. Not yet, but coming soon. And there is an effort underway to do a similar project for the hundreds of thousands of Newark News photographs that were also saved after the closing of the Newark News, and that are available here at the Newark Public Library. This is probably, if journalism is the first draft of history, which is hardly an original comment, but if the newspaper, if journalism is the first draft of history, almost that complete draft is available here at the library. And for anybody working on any topic in Newark or New Jersey history in the period from, well, the beginning of the 20th century through 1972, this is a first stop. So with that, as background, I do also want to say that at the end, we're hoping that Newark News alumni will have the opportunity to identify themselves and perhaps add some stories to those that are relayed by the panel tonight. But with that, Jerry, why don't we start with you and your overview. If you use this microphone, it's plugged into the speakers on the wall, and probably the one to use.
I was told this is a bad room for sound. Is it okay back there? Is it all right over there? Good. All right, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank... Quiet! Who am I? That's sort of a Buddhist question. I'm not sure. It depends on what time of the day. My name is Jerome. I'm Professor Emeritus at Rutgers at the School of Communication, Information, and Library Studies in New Brunswick. But probably what is more important in terms of Newark, I was a copy boy at the Newark Evening News for 2 years while I was also going to Rutgers Newark. I then worked at the paper for 4 years on the state desk in the Middlesex Bureau. And in terms of Newark credentials, I worked at Bamberger's wrapping packages, and I also was an elf in the Thanksgiving parade, Bamberger parade. I was a bill collector for delinquent accounts in Newark, which is also a life learning experience. But actually, my task tonight is to be moderator, and also just give a little bit of an overview. And I think we have so many Newark Evening News alumni here that I hope I'm not going to be over informationing you. But how many are here from the Newark News? Great. If you'll give me a few minutes, let me just frame the history of the paper and then what are some of the key issues that we want to talk about tonight. As you know, as Tim and Warren noted before, this is the 125th anniversary year of the creation of the Newark Evening News. It first appeared in September 1st, 1883 as a 4-page paper. In 1958, the 75th anniversary of the paper, it had a 92-page anniversary edition, and the whole paper was 226 pages. So that it went from this four-page, 7-column little paper to the colossus that it was at one time. I have instructions tonight, and that is that we are here for a celebration of the life of the paper, rather than mourning the death of the paper. That doesn't mean we're going to censor anybody in terms of if you have thoughts about this, about what happened to the paper, why. But it's sort of a difficult issue to even unravel. And it's something I'm hoping that those of you who have been here longer than I have at the Newark News may have some suggestions. What we're going to do basically is talk for a little bit here and then open it up to a conversation with you on the floor. So that'll be the basic focus of this. As you all know, the paper was nationally respected. It certainly was the premier state newspaper. It was known all over the country, and when I went overseas to work in Paris at the International Tribune, people there knew the paper. As a matter of fact, Nate Schneerman, who was at the Newark News, was the one who arranged for me to get overseas to work there. And people there knew about the paper. Everyone knew about the paper, wherever we were. It was called the Old Lady of Market Street by the Star-Ledger because of its grayness of tone and its encyclopedic memory, but I think there was a little bit of jealousy there as well. At one point, someone was trying to pay the paper a compliment and said that the Newark Evening News was the New York Times of New Jersey, to which the reporters at the news said, wait a minute, the New York Times is the Newark News of New York. As I mentioned before, I worked as a copy boy for about 2 years, and actually Doug Eldridge had just come on the paper at that point, and I was on Nightside, so that I had the privilege of going for his coffee in Danish every 2 hours. That was part of my duty. Part of the copy boys are now we now call them news clerks, but my copy boy duties were to go to Market Street, which was filled with gin mills and delicatessens, I think, basically. And in one of my excursions to buy the Danish and the coffee for everyone on Nightside, I was arrested. There was a private guard, who was beating a drunk in front of one of the gin mills. And I stopped and I said, I think you're hurting him, why don't you stop him? Because he doesn't know what you're doing. He said, you're under arrest. Luckily, the Star-Ledger photographer was walking by at that point, and he saw what was happening. He ran upstairs to the Nightside and told them, the Newark Evening News people, the night editors, Frank Rooney, the copy editors, the reporters, that they're beating up their copy boy. So suddenly, out of the news burst the cavalry. They all came running in their shirt sleeves to save me. It scared the hell out of the guard. He let me go right away. The thing I always resented, though, is I found out later that before they came down to save me, they called for a photographer. But seriously, the 4 years I spent at the news on the state desk and the 2 years as a copy boy really were a life-changing experience for me, and I think for many of you in this room, in different ways, each of you has a story to tell about why it was so important to be at the news and what it did to you and for you. And I'm excusing the tedium of doing police checks. I mean, that was the curse of the Newark News, that every 2 hours we had to do 30 or 40 police checks each. We had these very fanciful expense accounts and overtime that was creatively imagined. And that basically kept us going. We also had to drive all over the state to get photos of any accident victim. My sense of it was that if you were riding a bicycle anywhere in many parts of New Jersey and fell off the bike, you would be in the paper the next day, possibly with a photo. One of the reasons that Warren and Tim asked me to be here this evening is that the New Jersey Press Association last year celebrated its 150th anniversary. It's actually the oldest press association in the U.S. and they asked me to do a book on the newspapers of New Jersey. I agreed to do it, and it was interesting in that I was trying not to be biased toward the news in terms of giving it too much play, but there was no way to avoid the fact that the Newark News and the story of the Newark News was so important. It ended up being the first chapter in a whole series of chapters on newspapers in the state. I was struck by a number of things. One was how many people who succeeded at the paper, who became really important within the state, who became really important nationally, and in some cases internationally. I'm thinking of a couple of people that I interviewed. Richard Reeves, many of you probably know David Beam have worked with him, but Richard Reeves started out as an engineer and then decided he wanted to go into newspaper work. And Dick Harpster, who was up in Warren County, got him an interview with Mickey McMiniman. And then Dick Reeves became a reporter at the Newark News. Just one quote from Dick when I was doing the interview with him. He said, "I look back on it as the best days of my life. I'd go back and do it again." He is now, of course, a national columnist. He's a biographer of at least 3 or 4 presidents. He's teaching out at University of Southern California, and he's a wonderful person to talk with. Tonight on our panel, we have 3 really illustrious journalists who I'll introduce in a little bit who were at the Newark News. And again, many of you in the audience can carry this whole thing. We almost should get away with this, knock down this lectern and knock down this table and just have a roundtable conversation, because so many of you gave so much of yourselves to the paper, and we really appreciate it. Just a little bit of history. Again, it was Wallace Scudder, who was 30 years old, a Newark attorney. Henry Abbott, Steele, 32, Philadelphia newspaperman, and Lawrence Mott, 27, who also founded the Trenton Times, who created the Newark News back in 1883. Mott left after a few months. Steele became editor and retired in 1903. Scudder became sole owner, and he died in 1931. And his son, Edward Scudder, became a publisher. In 1950, his 2 sons took over, Richard Scudder as publisher and Edward Jr. as president. Now, the paper itself, on September 1st, 1883, the first paper came out with 8,000 copies. It quickly sold out, and by the following day, they had to get a bigger press to do a 10,000 copy run. The paper began with 2 reporters and an editor. It was printed at 844 Broad Street, and then the following year went to 215 Market Street. And then it just grew after that. The first paper, I don't know if there's anything on display here. Is there, Martin, or outside? Okay, so I'll do a visual hand puppet thing. It was a 7-column newspaper. No illustrations. This is the first issue. No illustrations. It contained basically 7 columns of display ads, a half column of classified, so that roughly 25% of the 4 pages was advertising. Scudder and Steele, the 2 co-owners of the paper, actually stood behind the counter and were selling papers. They encouraged their paper boys and staff, the 2 reporters and editor, to go abroad and market and start circulating. I understand that the owners of the paper paid the printers in nickels and dimes, which was the money that was coming back that day. They literally had to do that. The paper boys would come and buy a paper for a penny, then run out and sell it for 2 cents, and then come back to get more papers. The rest of the story we all know. The paper expanded in a major kind of way. It went into the suburbs, it went into the stateside. It became, if there was anything ever being a statewide newspaper, it was the Newark Evening News. But there were a number of strategic errors, and again, we can talk about that tonight. Maybe one of the first ones was the idea of putting all the printing facilities in downtown Newark when the population was spreading. It was getting more difficult to deliver the papers, to print and deliver, and an awful lot had a different purpose to this. The other thing that was a real difficulty was television. In the 1950s and 1960s, television eroded the power of the afternoon papers. And we had to try to deal with this. I interviewed Richard Scudder for the book, and he basically told me that he wanted to switch to a morning newspaper, but was overruled by the board. He said it was a fatal mistake to sell the paper, and I know that we'll have some response to this. And he said it was heartbreaking to see what happened to the paper. And quote, "We could have gone morning and we would have swept the boards with the Star Ledger, but I didn't have the votes on the Newark Evening News Board." This is the position of Richard Scudder. When I interviewed him, he was 93 years old in 2006. He was chairman of Media News Group. It's now the fourth largest chain of newspapers in the United States. He and William G. Singleton created these papers, and the story of their interaction is a whole different story in the film. In 1970, the Scudder brothers sold the paper, along with the Garden State Paper Company and an engraving plant, to Media General of Richmond, Virginia. The numbers vary because they were paid in stock, but the value of the stock was anywhere from 35 up to 40 million. And I think Doug has better numbers than I do on that. Media General basically came in and looked at the budget and started cutting the budget and kill the overtime, kill the expense accounts. Some reporters said, you know, we feel like we're working for tips when they finally saw their paychecks. The newspaper guild was formed in 1971. There was a strike in May of '71, supported by the craft unions. There was no settlement with all of the unions until April of 1972. In August of 1972, the paper shut down. At that point, it had 140,000 circulation claimed. The story was that half that 140,000 may not have been papers sold or returned on a daily basis. That's sort of the picture. I must say that aside from also being saved by the Star Ledger from going to jail when I was copy boy, I admire the Star Ledger in terms of what it's done in recent years. Jim Wilsey has done a marvelous job with the paper. Before him, Mordecai came in, and more frankly, his quote was pretty much of a rag when he talked about the Star Ledger, and he knew that he had to do something there. I just wish that both papers could be here today. I think one final thing I want to talk about, and that is thank the Newark Public Library for taking the initiative. And I think Warren and John Cunningham, where's John? John, many people played a role in this, but I know that I was talking to George Foley today, and he told me the initiative that he took to get the collection here. And I think it's so important. I spent a little bit of time, I got in here a little bit earlier today, and I spent some time this afternoon looking at the collection. And I urge you to come back and look at it. And there's something like 800,000 photographs. There are all kinds of books that are out of Charles Dickens where each thing is handwritten in terms of the story. I tried to find some of my own stories, and I think I have to come back and look a little bit more carefully. But again, a second story. I am grateful to the Newark Public Library because all of my clippings were in a box in an attic in our home in Hunterdon County when I was teaching at RUTGERS. And a raccoon got into the attic. And the raccoon proceeded to take all of my clips and tear them in little pieces to make a bed for the raccoon cubs that were just born. So I need to fill in my collection and get my revenge on the raccoon. When that happened, about 2 days afterward, I was moderating a Press Barn seminar. And one of the justices of the New Jersey Supreme Court spoke after me, and he said, when I go back and read some of my decisions, I wish I had a raccoon. just a closing note, and that is, in doing the book for New Jersey Press Association, it was basically a history of the newspapers, but the other parallel story that is running through the book is what is happening to newspapers in terms of the internet and the digital age that we're in. And it is such a really important time for us at the universities to be deciding what to do with curriculum and training. It's very important for the libraries to play a major role in this. One of the things we talked about today when I was looking at the collection was the idea of digitizing, of getting all these photos, getting these clips, getting these notes, and somehow preserving them in a digital format that can be put over on the internet or stored in databases and made available to so many other people. So I've rambled on enough, and I want to thank you for your patience and no one putting food at me. And there are no raccoons in the audience, I hope. What I'd like to do now is to turn to the panel. And first of all, I'll give you a little bit of background on each of them. Angelo Baglivo, Andy Baglivo, Andy Bag, I think at one point, was it called Andy Bag? So, yes.
Competition school.
But really a wonderful form of political reporter, who then led to start his own public relations firm very successfully. Bill Gordon, who was a wonderful feature writer at both the News and the Star Ledger, and when I was doing the research, I really enjoyed going back and reading some of the pieces that you wrote about the News and about the Star Ledger. And of course, Doug Eldridge, who I used to buy the Danish and coffee for, right? Doug, no, seriously, Doug and actually Frank Crowell was the other person who was on Nightside. Frank became a noted wine critic for the New York Times. But I knew Frank before when he was still drinking wine when he unscrewed the cap. But Doug has had so many, marvelous experiences, and again, we're going to hear from him in a little bit. He was influential in creating the guild, the unit. He worked in the New York City government, and he's now executive director of the Newark Preservation and Landmarks Committee. And what we've asked is that each of the three panelists talk maybe about 5 minutes apiece or whatever about their own thoughts about the newspaper and the experiences there. And then we want to open it up. We want to open it up for comments, questions. You can't throw anything, but you can be as heated as you wish. So let's start with Andy first.
Thank you.
So you know a little about me. Native of Newark, grew up in what is now the Central Ward, went to Westside High School, went to RUTGERS School of Journalism, worked at the Newark News between my junior and senior years, and for some reason they invited me back after graduation, and I was there for 20 years. I was wondering why anybody would want to hear an 80-year-old guy reminisce about his past newspaper days, but after listening to the professor here, I realized somebody might be interested. I thought we were here to sell his book, which I'm sure you'll try afterward. In his book, Jerry used a word which has never been used on me before or since. He called me beloved. Now, I don't know if that was personal, or somebody told you that, but a lot of politicians are turning in their grave when they read that word. Beloved.
You were beloved among your colleagues.
John Farmer, who is now probably writing about what happened in Florida today, because without his explanation, none of you would understand what happened. And there's some people in the audience I'd like to introduce before I talk a little bit more about it. John Cunningham was my mentor. He sat right next to me in the city room, and at lunch he would drag me across the Passaic River to some Italian place, and he would eat a lot and try to stick me with the bill. I was just starting out, so I couldn't afford it. But sitting next to him was a real privilege. In the back of the room is the man I replaced as a political reporter when he went on to work with Governor Dick Hughes, Joe Katz. Guy who didn't want to be introduced, I'm going to introduce him anyhow because he was here at City Hall before I began covering City Hall, Ted Kosher. And a friend of mine who plays poker with me now, but not a Newark newsman, but he was the former bureau chief of the AP in Trenton, and then the managing editor of the King and Courier Post, John Colasar, back there. So you can see in the newspaper life, you wind up with some friends and you're very loyal, and you're with you most of your life. The Newark News to me was, when I worked there at least, was indeed the paper of record in New Jersey. It was indisputable. We were the biggest, and we were the best. And remember one thing, and I'm not disparaging the Star Ledger now because they have become an excellent newspaper. But in those days, you had your internet, you had your cable news. So we were it. If you wanted to find out what was happening in the state of New Jersey, for better or for worse, you had to read the Newark News. And we organized almost like a little army. Bureaus all over the state, which were used both to cover those areas and also for us to find out who really had promise of being promoted to the city staff as city reporters. So it had a double function. That staff out there was on hand to cover any of the many disasters that New Jersey is famous for. And let me tell you something. There is no state that turns out more news than the state of New Jersey. Incidentally, how many of you actually read the Newark Evening News? Could you put your hands up for me? It is an elderly crowd, isn't it? Who did read the Newark News? Let me put it that way. That's it. Some young people in the audience.
We live in state.
Well, we were all over the country. The Newark News to me, not only was a paper of record, but it brought together people of such talent that I've never worked with them before. Since it was a fun place, we had a real camaraderie and spirit that I've never encountered anyplace else, and I think it still exists today. I think those people who are here today will tell you that, and the fact that they're here tells you that too. Let me just tell you a couple of the stories that I remember that were breakthrough kind of stories. The Woodbridge train crash. Train crashed around rush hour in the evening in Woodbridge, and there were 70 to 80 deaths. The Newark News dispatched its vast army of reporters, and the next morning, that paper had photographs and little biographies on every one of the casualties. Now, when you talk about breaking news coverage, that was certainly eligible for a Pulitzer Prize, but for some reason, the editors or the publishers never really entered stories for Pulitzer Prize consideration, and there were many others too. Much to their chagrin, the Newark News helped elect a Democratic governor, and that was not what they had hoped for, but in 1953, Bob Miner was running against a man named Paul Trost. And Paul Trost looked like he was going to win that election because it was still a Republican state. And we had a terrific Republican governor, probably the man I consider the best governor in the history of New Jersey, Al Driscoll. Trost was ahead. But someone on the Newark News, one of our reporters, came up with a letter that Paul Trost had written to a labor racketeer who was in prison at the time. His name was Joe Fay. And when that story broke, Trost spent the rest of the campaign trying to defend himself for doing that and lost the election by a couple 100,000 votes. Bob Binder won that election, and he won re-election afterward. I don't know if any of you remember, there was an extraordinary series of plane crashes in Elizabeth one year, around the Christmas time. We had 3 planes go down in the city of Elizabeth within 2 months. And again, we covered it like an army covering it too. It was another extraordinary thing. You people know, some of you may know, because we had a panel discussion on it a couple of years ago. The Newark News was primarily responsible for the charter change in New York City government. It was with the help of a lot of people, mostly women incidentally, who began to feel their political muscles way back in 1954 and demonstrated it then. But that's what wanted the referendum to change government at the time. For many years, the Newark News, for better or for worse, was the single most formidable obstacle to the creation of a broad-based tax in New Jersey. It finally broke when Dick Hughes had a referendum on a ballot for a bond issue, and believe it or not, it was going to be backed by turnpike tolls. You hear that before? Well, if you read Fran Wood's column, and Fran Wood, the electric column, is sitting right there. She's one of my favorite columns now, but she wrote it Sunday. That's when that thing went down, it left the way open eventually for a broad-based tax. We started with an income tax proposal. That didn't get through the Democratic legislature. We went to a sales tax. That finally got through. And then when Brendan Byrne came into office, he got us an income tax for real. So now we have not only one, but 2 broad-based taxes, and maybe we'll have something else too. Rising tolls every 5 years or something like that. As far as the death of the Newark News goes, I may have a different slant on it than Jerry does. I think the major reason was very bad policy decisions made by the then publishers, the sons of the original, one of the original founders, Richard and Ned Scudder. I know Richard has gone on to make a lot of money in the newspaper business, but I can tell you, wherever he goes, they will not have first-class newspapers because he just did not have the interest in the Newark News as a newspaper that the people before him did. His primary interest was in a paper mill in Garfield. Remember that, Terry? Did you mention that in your book? Oh, too bad. It recycled used newsprint into usable newsprint. He made a fortune out of it, and most of his interest became focused on that, and as a result, the paper suffered. I think the fact that we built too much in Newark, we decided to build our printing plants in Newark where our circulation was fading, and ignore the suburbs where it was growing. We just could not get the papers out as an afternoon newspaper to our readers out there. You've seen what traffic is like in downtown Newark, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And that was one of the main reasons there. We also had what a friend of mine, the late John McLaughlin, columnist, described as the most ill-timed strike in history of journalism. And that already shattered an already vulnerable newspaper. At the same time, the Star Ledger, which had been a laughing stock, began to improve tremendously under a new editor called Ward Polly. It got better and better. So you had a paper that was already on shaky legs, hurt by a strike, and with the opposition suddenly being more than competitive. And all of that, I think, added up to a paper that had no place to go. And so it died. I don't call it a death, I call it a homicide, because many people participated in that. They keep clapping, I'm going to be here all night. I love it. But I think think if you have questions for me later, I've spoken enough, and I'll be here. Thank you.
Like a high school reunion, we might need some yearbook photos to help us identify each other. I was glad that Warren Grover and Tim Chris arranged this event. I told them that this is my wife's birthday, and they said that that's of less consequence. So we're here together, and so she will have a special night to remember. And I'm very glad. This means once more the Newark News is interfering with my family life after all these years. I last spoke about the Newark News in the early 1980s. I was given 15 minutes and I talked for 55. And I've thought of some things since then that I should have said, but I will try to spare you that tonight. I was not a Newarker. I was not a New Jerseyan. I grew up in upstate New York, and I discovered the Newark News while I was in college, and it was a revelation that I have never quite recovered from. I happened to work at an oil refinery down in Linden, the Bayway refinery, and it was a summer job, and one of my tasks was to go through the local area newspapers and find any news that might be of concern to people working at the refinery. And that's when I first saw the Newark News. I could not believe it. I had never seen a paper so big, so fat, so full of so much, and it still astonishes me. Some of you may have forgotten, but the Newark News literally was longer than any other newspaper at the time. It was a couple inches longer. It was like they couldn't fit all the news in a regular sized page, so they put a couple extra inches on it, and they filled it from front to back, 64 or more pages a day from all over the world. I was awestruck. And then I decided I could probably use some summer work. The following summer I applied, and I went home to spend the spring vacation, and I got a telegram at my house. I couldn't believe it. One of the few telegrams I ever got in my life. I got a telegram, and it said, it was from the city editor of the Newark News, and it said, change in plans allows me to offer you a $55 a week job. And I thought, wow, this is a real serious news. This is a big operation. You know, for $55 a week, I got a telegram. Of course I took it. So, of course I snapped it up. And I went to work, and I spent 15 mostly good years there. And when I came into it, I felt like I was a seminarian assigned to the Vatican, or I was an amateur hour winner who was suddenly expected to play the palace. This was big time. This was the real thing. I had never worked in a place with so many people doing so many different things. I worked there for 15 years, and there were people who worked there many of the same years that I never met. They were stationed in the outlying areas. They traveled all over the world. We sent people as far as Antarctica for stories. And there aren't a whole lot of stories down in Antarctica, because the Newark News actually sent a reporter down to Antarctica. And we had 2 labor reporters, not one, but 2. There was one for the AFL, one for the CIO. There were 2 reporters at City Hall. There were 2 reporters at the county courthouse. There were reporters day and night at Newark Police Headquarters. No matter what happened in the city during those hours, you would find those stories in the paper. And there were bureaus all over the state covering towns that maybe some of us have never heard of. It was incredible. It was awesome. I know when we started having some meetings in the newspaper in the final years, the then publisher came out and looked around at the staff in the city room, and he said, I never knew there were so many of you. And that was ominous, believe me. He knew then he didn't need so many of us, and that's the whole, that was the beginning of a whole other story. But we went so many places, did so many things. It was indeed like something out of the front page, like something out of the movies. It really did happen. The big story, the Big Town Illustrated Press, all of that stuff. It really was true in some ways. And it was a great, great experience for many of us. I stayed like almost a cub reporter. I've got some pictures taken of the staff of the news in later years. And when you look at those pictures, several things will strike you, particularly in today's world. One, they're nearly all male. Almost every one of these pictures is male. Two, with one or two rare exceptions, they're all white. And three, they're all pretty old. And that's the kind of paper it was. People went there, they worked for long, long careers. It was like the civil service. You weren't going to give up anything like that. There were people who worked there for so long because they couldn't afford to be in the pension plan. The salaries were so low, you had to stay on the payroll. And that was the only way. There was one woman who'd been there for over 40 years and she was earning $120 in the last years. But those are, it was a very quirky place. It had lots of quaint traditions. All the years I worked at the Newark News, I never received a paycheck as such. They didn't believe in checks if they could be avoided. Every Friday, a man with an armed guard would come into the newsroom with a whistle and blow the whistle, and people would line up. It was like a Pavlovian experience. You would line up to get your pay, and the pay would be in little envelopes, and in every envelope was your exact salary in cash, and it was always in $20 bills and $2 bills. The only place that I ever knew that used $2 bills was the Newark News, and there were all of these very quaint customs, and it was just the way you've always done it. If you go into that Newark News morgue and you want to find some clippings about the radio or radio stations, you have to look under wireless. Everything about radio is filed under wireless. There were all of these strange traditions that developed and lasted for so many years. I have to tell you very honestly, some of the traditions in those days were not so quaint, not so comfortable. When I was sent out as a young reporter to write about, to chase police stories, to go to crimes and accidents, and I would call back to the city desk and say, well, somebody was killed in a traffic here, or somebody was held up and robbed, and so on. The question they would ask me, and I'm not kidding you tonight, was, is it colored? And I knew that was a leading question. If I said yes, the victim was a person of color, I knew it would be 2 paragraphs inside the paper. If it was a white victim, I knew there would be something else. So I learned very early on to say, I didn't get a look, I couldn't see what the victim was. I'm sorry, they had a shroud over them or something like that. And that was the only way you could get a decent play for your story. When I went to work on that newspaper, apartments and houses were still advertised by race. There were apartments that would say white tenancy, colored tenancy, things like that. Fortunately, they moved beyond that, but the news was very glacial in some ways to adapt to changing times. We never had two-way radios or telephones. We never had many of the modern things that you would expect, and of course this is in the pre-digital age, but we wrote our stories on manual typewriters. We wrote them without making copies. We always took a chance that anything could be lost. You write these stories on plain paper, no copies. They would be marked up with pencils like these. I still got a few of them. They're pencils you don't have to sharpen because nobody had time to sharpen a pencil. You'd unwrap these things on the top. It's like they're China markers. They would use that to mark up the copy. And of course the type was all metal. It was set in lead type. There were banks of these clattering machines. The whole thing. We had the latest in 19th century technology. And it was really quite an experience to go through this. But somehow, in spite of all this, the Newark News did succeed in its own way. We had a kind of Olympian view of the world and what was around us. I had a very rough, I was only been on the paper for a couple of months, and I had an unforgettable lesson and almost lost my job. An editor called me. I was alone in the city room on a Sunday, and he called me and he said, I hear there's quite a fire in the Ampere section. What do you know about it? And I said, well, I don't know, but we're watching the wire machines. He said, this is the Newark News. You don't watch any wire machines. You go out and get the story. And I was lucky to have survived that day, and that was ingrained in me. we were told not to depend on anything we read anyplace else, especially the Star-Ledger. Wow, you never trusted anything from the Ledger, unfortunately, even when they did good things. So we grew up with a certain atmosphere, a certain ethos, if you will, that this was just the peak of the journalistic profession in New Jersey. We didn't realize, of course, the times were changing, that the world was changing, and I have to ask myself today, you know, we can argue endlessly about what killed the Newark News, who killed the Newark News, but we look in almanacs now and look at the America's 50 largest cities. There are only 10 of them that have more than one newspaper. And in some of those cities, those newspapers are jointly owned. Where is the Philadelphia Bulletin? Where is the New York Herald Tribune? Where is the Washington Star? Each of them had its own claims to distinction. The Newark News story was not unique. Yes, it's very special for people in New Jersey, but papers have died all over the place. And the Newark News, unfortunately, is in a very crowded graveyard. So it's not a wake. I won't forget that, Warren. It's not a wake. It's not a memorial service. But the Newark News did loom very large in the history of New Jersey. For those of us who were fortunate enough to be there, it's still a nice thing to put on your resume. And when I have to go out and get another job, I will probably still put it on my resume because it was a great, great place to be. And its departure has left, I think, a big void in our civic life. No blogs, no, digital media are going to fill that void. The Newark News, the loss of the Newark News has lessened our civic discourse, if you will, and it certainly has left a void in a lot of hearts, many of which are here tonight, and I thank you.
I went through a little arthritis. I became a food fright. Going over the stuff for sissies. This one here? Yeah. That raccoon was, I think, was a reincarnation of the Newark News editor. I joined the Newark News about the same time that Doug Eldridge did, maybe a year or two before that. And I came to it from in a roundabout way. I was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and my first job in a newspaper was in Austin, New York, on vacation in Sing Sing prison. I spent a couple of years there, and I learned firsthand on that job that the rest of my career in newspapers would probably be burdened with financial travail. I asked the editor, because I was hired there, I didn't ask him how much I was being paid. I asked him,
You gotta use the motor to hear you. I can hear you.
Can't hear you.
You're getting lost.
sorry.
Push it over. Lift it up.
Lift. Good.
I asked the editor, Mr. Narr, Joe Narr, who wrote every inch of Mr. Dithers in the comic strip, including the stool that he sat on. I asked him, Mr. Narr, could you tell me where I could lodge in the city, lodge accounts? And he said, Bill, he says, we're not going to pay you enough to live here. You're going to have to live at home and drive 30 miles from Mount Vernon up to Austin. So that was my first inkling of the travail I was going to expect from newspapers. And it got worse when I got to the Newark News. But I came down and joined the Long Branch Record, and in the process got friendly with the Newark News staff and the Belmar Bureau. And after 3 years at the Long Branch Record, I was hired at that bureau. And I remained there for 3 years. Then a call came down from Newark. They wanted a volunteer to join the rewrite bank up in Newark. They went by seniority. And, the bureau chief didn't want the job because the shore was an idyllic place to live and have a family. And the second in command, for the same reason, refused and went down the line, and I was the newest guy there. And I accepted it because it offered great learning opportunities. And I went to East Orange, took out an apartment there for my family, and stepped into the Newark News building for the first time in my life. I was shocked. It was a shambles, I thought. It looked like a factory that had been deserted, and the Newark News moved in with Salvation Army furniture. The walls were unpainted. It was really dismal. And I was discouraged for a little while, but I was also encouraged because it looked like an old-fashioned newspaper. And I seemed to enjoy that. I remember Jimmy Breslin was asked one time why he enjoyed working on newspapers, and this was some years ago. And he said, well, it's the only place I know of where you can throw your cigar butt on the floor and nobody would care. And that's the way it was there. Doug mentioned that it was sort of a quirky paper, and it certainly was. He mentioned the rewrite bank and the way we had to write our stories. I was put on a rewrite bank, and that consisted of 6 backs to back, and on it was Irv White, remember him? Irv White sat next to me, and Bob Kirschbaum sat next to me on the other side. And I was there for 1 week, and I was filling out my expenses and overtime forms. And Bob Kirschbaum, who had been there for quite some time, looked over and I said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm filling out my expense account and overtime. And I put in maybe $2 for a cab, and maybe $3.50 for telephone calls outside. And he grabbed the papers out of my hand, and he scribbled some stuff on it, and he gave me a $35 a week raise right there. He said, that's the way we do it up here. And I didn't know that down at the Belmont office. But I loved the Newark News, with all its quirks. I remember it had no security at all. Anybody could wander up drunk from Market Street, and they did quite often. We had one individual come in one night, it was Saturday night, we were working at Doubletree. And he wandered over to the copy desk, and he had a ship's model in his hand. He wanted to sell the ship's model. And it turned out that he had just gotten out of prison, Federal State Prison, and he built this model ship in the prison. He made cannons out of the 22 shells that the guards had given him from Plymouth Guard. Across the street at the Novelty Bar, he had about a dozen more. So all the rewrite bank poured down the street into the Novelty Bar and bought these things. And I took one home and I still have it. We had one time, there was quite a number of people just to wander up into the city room. And this bothered one of our reporters, one of our editors, Dr. David. And he was incensed by this. He didn't believe that shooting the other news was unprofessional. And one time a guy walked in, and he had sort of the 3 days growth, and he wandered over to the sports department and he asked some questions. Then he was wandering down, he was smoking a cigar, and David got up from his desk and he went over to him and he said, I'm sick and tired of you bums coming up from Market Street. Get out of here. And the individual said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. He wandered out. Somebody reminded him that was Willie Ratner, who had been with the paper for 65 years as a I know, but those things were always happening. And there were many characters. A good friend of mine was Dan Grant, who happened to be a nephew of the philosopher, Will Grant. And he was a comedian, and he on occasion would buy too much. And he would be missing from the paper for 3 or 4 days, then he would show up and resume his work, and it was very good. One day he came in after an absence of about a week, and he was on crutches and his head was bandaged. And he hobbled into the center of the room, and all of a sudden, the entire city room went quiet, and heads turned and looked at him. And he said, I asked for a raise. I enjoyed everybody getting paper, and except for the one thing that bothered me throughout my whole career, and probably did everybody else too, that was money. You never had enough money. To get a mortgage on a house, which I eventually bought in Cedar Grove, the bank refused to give me a mortgage because I didn't make enough money. And I had to convince Ed Screw, who was our business manager, I believe, at the time, Ed Screw. I had to convince him that to write a letter to the bank pointing out that we made so much in addition to our salary in expenses and overtime, and that got me the mortgage. You couldn't buy an automobile unless you had a letter from Ed Screw, attesting to the fact that you had this crooked expense account and overtime. And that was a survival. I was very lucky at the news. I learned a lot from people who worked there for years. I got into writing general assignment stories. And Harry Anderson loved me because he found out when I first came up here that having graduated from high school, I worked for a circus in Florida for a month or two. And he was a crazy fan about circuses. In fact, he used to host the advance band from the circuses that came to town or came to Jersey. They would come in with fistfuls of tickets, and he would take them to the treat restaurant and take me with him. And we'd have a 3 martini lunch, and the afternoon would be wiped out. He also used to carry in his wallet a little card with the name of the circus that he was going to that particular day and that afternoon. And he did this so that if he was hit by a car or had a heart attack, his wife would know that he wasn't going on an assignation somewhere. These kind of crazy people we had, they were wonderful. But as I say, I was lucky. I was given general assignments that were very good, and eventually became a feature writer and got a mine disasters in Pennsylvania, Oxford, Selma, Montgomery, March on Montgomery, and later on they sent me to Vietnam. They thought when they were sending me there that I knew my way around the battlefield because I had been in Korea. I didn't. I was with the Field Artillery and Marines and didn't know a thing, but I didn't tell them that. But again, the financial thing came in. I had to insist that my wife get a check that accumulated my expenses and overtime normally, so that we'd have enough to live on. And they said they would, but they didn't. And a month after I got over to Vietnam, my wife wrote to me and said we couldn't buy groceries. We didn't have enough money to pay the mortgage and whatnot. And so I called Vin Slavin and told him to get on it, and he went after them, and eventually they returned it. But I had these episodes with the Newark News and other newspapers throughout. It wasn't until I got to the Ledger that everything changed. In fact, I couldn't believe there were rugs on the floor. Typewriters, you couldn't hear typewriters, just a little click, 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 very reassuring clicks of the computers, which I didn't know how to use, and I had to go through an apprenticeship to try it out. And it became a wonderful experience and made me a feature writer there too, when I did the things I love most. But I'd like to end this now with rambling a little bit, and I'd like to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Why don't we start having the conversation? Would anyone like to comment, question? If not, panel, we'll have plenty more to say.
We have a gentleman here.
Okay, I understand, is there a microphone that you want to have moved around? Is that? I'll tell you what, I'll repeat.
I can project.
You can
I'll
shout.
repeat.
No, you can speak loud.
Okay, my name is Bill Doolittle. I was a reporter for the Newark News for several years. Education writer for the last part of my tenure. I wanted to say, apropos of Richard Scudder, that I had an extraordinary experience a few years before yours. My son was getting married down in Rumson, and I went to a pre-nuptial party, and he was there. We sat down and talked for hours. It must have been 3 hours about the Newark News. And he said what you said, which was it was a terrible mistake not to go AM. And he didn't say anything about the board, and I kind of doubt that story because the Scudders control the board. But in any case, he did say that the paper should have gone AM, but he said, I didn't dare go up against the New York Times. I thought we'd be killed. And then he said that the Times would overwhelm him. He said, I was wrong. he said, and then he told me the story about his circulation manager, who, when he was a very young publisher, and he said that how can we get at people who are moving out of Newark into the suburbs, especially up into Bergen County. And the circulation manager says, we can't go up there because they won't let our trucks on the Garden State Parkway. And if you recall, the Bergen Record did it with station wagons. I remember them well. They had brown station wagons running up and down that parkway, and they ate the Newark News as lunch. And by the time it was over, you know, the Bergen Record was 100,000, and people were moving out like crazy, and the PM papers all over the country couldn't keep up because the AM papers I don't believe it was as much television as it was the fact that they could follow their readers to the suburbs. The PM papers couldn't, because the PM papers came out during the evening rush, hit the rush, got tied up, whereas the AM papers could roll all during the night, whereas we had to put the stuff in the paper and get it out instantly for dinner, and it wasn't working anymore. But at the end of this conversation, Scudder said to me, you know, Bill, you know, just because you're the son of a successful publisher doesn't mean you know what's going on. That was an extraordinary conversation. Quite elderly, I think he was 90.
There was no board.
The what?
There was no board.
Yeah.
The board, this was a decision,
Yeah.
two brothers.
And you're right about the Garden State Paper Company. And I was riding down, I used to commute with Peter Carter, who I was on the rewrite desk with Bill and Vinny and Peter Carter. And when I was first there, my first day, I was making out, or week, I was making out my expense account, and Bill noticed me kind of putting down telephone, you know, this and that, and he said to Vinny, no, he said to Peter, who sat to my right, he said, tell Bill how to make this thing out, or we're all going to get screwed. So, you know, that everybody has those stories from the news, but the Garden State Paper Company situation was exactly as you say. He started that with a patent from Europe, and I was riding on the train after the Newark News was supposed to be sold to Time Incorporated. I don't know if everyone remembers that, but after it was on the front page of the New York Times. I read it. But then the stock went down and there was problems and they couldn't close. And I got on, but I realized, because my family had been in the newspaper business, that once a paper is on the block, it's always on the block. And so I figured it's going to get sold. I was sitting in a car after the announcement, and Peter and I were talking, and there was Scudder. And I talked to him for a little bit. I was still working there. I talked to him for a little bit, and I said, I understand you're selling the news. You know, a year ago it was on the block, but I don't understand you selling the Garden State Paper Company. And he said to me, they wouldn't take the news without the paper company, and that day I started looking for a job.
Okay. Let me just quickly add 2 things. This is sort of a Russian effect. The split was between, whether the board existed or not, he claims there was a board, but the split was between the brothers, Richard and Ed. There was opposition from the other brother, basically. Again, just talking about the interview. The other thing that is also of interest is, you mentioned that he was afraid of the New York Times. In my interview with him, he basically said, I wasn't afraid of the New York Times because we knew that after we launched the the Sunday edition. There was a lot of opposition to the Sunday edition because of the fear of the New York Times. And he said once we knew that we could go up against the Times and get 400,000 out of the Sunday Call, et cetera, we were ready to do it. So, you know, it's hard because when we're doing these interviews, we have to take at face value, at least a little bit, and then dig underneath and find out where the bullshit is. But you know, it's the Rashomon theory. Everybody's looking at the same thing. I mean, you talk about the paper being a homicide at the end of the paper. My sense of it was that it was a man who had a lot of illnesses, any one of which could have been terminal or could have been cured, and just at that point he got hit by a truck, and the truck had Richmond, Virginia on the side of it. But it's and a lot of other cans up. So that 1, 2, please, and then 3. Okay. We have a deli line now. We have
Speak up.
Okay.
I'm Don Mazzella. I started working in Newark in 1965. And I also, by the way, grew up in Newark, reading the Newark News. And I walked into my first day at the city desk and met George Quintero and said to him, "Gee, Mr. Quintero, I've been reading you ever since I've started to read." And George got very upset about that. George Quintero was the Washington Washington bureau chief, came back to be the last real editor of the Newark News. But I'd like to address 2 points. One, I don't know if you realize how good the Newark News was written. And there are people in this room, Bill, et cetera, that were really great writers, all of you. And they certainly taught me how to write, because I came in and walked in and thought I knew a lot about writing. And Al Poto showed me soon enough that I did. Can I mention 2 names, Al Poto and Walter O'Toole, who are no longer with us? Every time I sit down at a desk today to write, he's almost over my shoulder. I can also, I really want to, when you go back and read the Newark News, I would encourage you all to, how good it was written. If you read it and you read today's newspapers, don't you see a difference? Don't you see how they always insist that we have to present the facts, and God forbid, I'll mention another name, Dick Blood. Any of you guys work under Dick Blood? He once sent me to a Genovese household at 2 o'clock in the morning to convince us that he was still alive. They had heard a report. So I walk out to the Genovese head household, and the FBI stops me and says, you know, I said, I'm here to find out if he's alive. And the FBI assures me he's alive. Then I said, well, you know it and I know it, but Dick Blood won't accept it. And Len Valenti is the other guy that I learned to remember. I started out at the paper young, and I still remember these guys, and you all do too. And this room to me is a pantheon of people who really knew. When Bill was in Vietnam, his stories in coming back from there. You can reread some of them and really feel the thing. I could go on and on, I'll give other people, but I just want to give one point. I was on a plane 10 years ago with a man who bought the Newark News for Media General. He didn't know that I had worked for the Newark News, and we got to talking. And I'll point out to you, they settled the guild strike, and then they closed the paper. And they told unions throughout the country after that, if we could close a profitable paper like the Newark News, we can do that to you if you give us trouble. And Media General has never had trouble with unions since. And the price of that has been the Newark News, which we all in New Jersey miss. That's all.
I have a question for Doug Eldridge, who spent a lot of time following people like me and others around the city during the civil rights movement. And I'd like to hear what it was like internally dealing with the turmoil and the changes that were going on in the city at that time within the Newark News.
It wasn't easy in some ways because I didn't have a whole lot of sympathy among the editors at that time. They realized that, I'm sorry, the editors, most of the editors that I worked for were not particularly sympathetic to some of the social changes. They knew there were stories there, they knew these things were significant, but they were not really too responsive to the things. And I had some negative feedback sometimes covering these things. There was a time when I became known as Douglas X to some of my colleagues. I don't broadcast that, but sometimes they were, because I would go out and report on a lot of the African American activities and developments, and I was seen as being, I guess, a little too open or attentive to things. And it was summed up for me one day. This is just to tell you what the atmosphere was like there. I was working on a Saturday night, and the Sunday paper came off, and by some strange twist of fate, there were pictures of 3 African Americans on the front page with 3 different stories. And one of the editors came over to me and he said, "Now, don't you think this has just gone too far?" And I said, "Well, hey, you know, it's been 100 years or so. Don't you think it's about time?" So, but that was the kind of exchanges you would have with the paper. But they did give me the time. They did run the stories as I wrote them. I wasn't subject to a lot of censorship or editing or twisting or anything like that. I mean, they took it as it came. It was one of the greatest unedited newspapers I think that you could work for, and the length of the stories is evidence of that. They just, you wrote it and they would run it, and a lot of good writing like bills and Andes and so on got in that paper without being tampered with. And very seldom was any story that I can recall ever twisted or turned to reflect some other point of view. So, and Bob was certainly a major source, I guess I can reveal that now, during some of those years of what some of the things that were going on in the city. But it was tough, and the news, it had one black reporter when I came to work there, and during most of the years that I was there was only one, sometimes 2, there were later years there were more, but it was not easy, and there were some who did not want to be covering necessarily African American news. There was one who went out and became an editor of Newsweek, John Dodson. And he was very resentful because they would send him up to street rallies when they thought there was going to be trouble. And he didn't feel that he should be the expendable one. And he did not care to cover news of some of the racial situations. So he moved on very quickly, and he went on for a very distinguished career, became editor of the Akron Beacon Journal and some other things. But it was a tricky role, and for a lot of us, and it became, as Black Power emerged, particularly during the 60s, the later 60s, the white press in particular was not welcome, and so there were times then when there was no one you could send anymore to some of these events. But times changed, and they were heady times to live through. And I'm sorry that the Newark News wasn't able to follow up on many of these other developments, and where are some of these people today, and what happened to all of it. But we did get past the Ken Gibson election and the change of power, political power to some degree in Newark. And so it was those were years I wouldn't trade for anything. But thanks for reminding me.
Thank you.
My name is Harry Robinson, and I'd like to bring a different perspective to what Doug and Andy and Bill have been talking about, because you heard all city sides of this city report. I was a sports writer, and I was the first African-American sports writer for a major metropolitan paper in United States history as far as I can tell. I was young, like Don said, when he got there, he was young. I started at the Newark Evening News before the March on Washington in 1963. And the curmudgeons that you might have had on the city side, we didn't quite have that in the sports department. Our chief Linelli, sports editor, assistant sports editor, Bailey Scott, whom had gone to Princeton with one of the startup, big startup leagues. Bailey was the president of NAACP in Red Bank. And Bailey was of Caucasian persuasion, by the way. He was not black. And they hired me in '63. Like I said, before the March on Washington. Our sports department was different. We had the greatest columnists, I think, in America, High Goldberg. Many of you will remember High Goldberg. If you look at television now, you see his son Hank on ESPN doing the horses and the football picks and so on, and he looks just like his dad. And nobody was as great as High Goldberg. When he died, Jerry Eisenberg wrote a column, if I recall. And then he said, everybody talks about these young guys writing great lines. Oh, you had a great line the other day. He said, I didn't write great lines, he wrote great columns. And he said that back in the day when the Jim Crow ruled sports and professional sports, and a lot of the writers in New York that covered the Dodgers and the Yankees and professional sports, they had their problems with people of color. I had problems with him. He said, but you never heard him curse, you never heard him disparage anyone, but he would just say, he's not a chap that I would like to have dinner with when he was talking about these other guys. So for me, again, like I said, I grew up reading the papers. And we were reading a lot of papers when we were little, you know, Jerome American from New York, the Legend, the Daily News, this and that. But I love comics. I mean, I can remember Snuffy Smith and the Journal American and the various comics that I read. And here, never thought, always wanted to be a journalist, but never thought that we'd get an opportunity with the major white papers. You know, the African American, well, you know, if that would be the place if I wanted to write. Subsequently, someone mentioned about Newark and Rutgers and so on. I went to Newark Rutgers. And having come out of that, about you went to Newark Rutgers also, I believe.
I did.
About 5 years after me.
Right. Yeah, sure.
He was before me.
Before you.
But Newark Evening News was Calvin West. I walked into the city room, and there was Calvin. Now, he was the person on the night side. And most of the sports guys, we were always there at night. So things took place in the evening. And you mentioned about the typewriters, the old Royal typewriters and manuals. Well, we used carbon paper with our story, so there was a copy of the story. That experience set a tone for me and enabled me to do some things for a lot of the sports writing I covered. Started out with high school sports, but enabled me to give a lot of our young people a lot of play, a lot of coverage. I selected the All-Star team. So guys got scholarships and so on from things that I was able to do from the sports side. And subsequently, you mentioned Walker O'Toole, and they started looking for more reporters of color. And they asked me if every one of the guys that I recommended they hired, and they did well. So the Newark News became more progressive. It might not have been up in the, you know, with Bill Clark and Dick Scudder and those guys up in the top, but there were people down lower that cared, that wanted us to do well, and stuck with us, and we learned how to write. We learned how to write to become better. We might have known a little before, but we got better and better because of the Bill Gordons. I can still remember all the stories, his pieces from Vietnam. Benny Slater went over after Bill went to Vietnam. He wrote some extraordinary pieces that came out. I mean, some things that would make you cry. And it's, you get a little emotional, but I remember when Calvin ran for council in 1966, and I wrote his first press release. You ride around in his car. I said, Calvin, what are you going to run on? Well, we do this, I couldn't put my name on it, but we sent it out and so on. And Calvin became the first city councilman at large of color in the history of Newark in 1966. And things the Newark News did not endorse him. You got a job. Yes, come back. Come back to work. You know, 2001. And you know, we covered it, you know what went on, and Don, I'm sure you know, it seemed time in the City Hall. But it gave me a learning experience that was just incredible. I used that and I segued out of that in the public relations in New York. I also used it and went to law school that night and got my law degree. The thing about it was the writing part from the Newark Evening News enabled me to just breeze through those legal exams and so on. So we knew how to write. It wasn't a lot of verbose kinds of things that we used that a lot of the non-reporting students had. So the Newark Evening News
said to her, I understand that I is going to work for the newspaper in Newark. My mother said, yes, we're very pleased. And he said to my mother, how much money is I getting? And she said, $35 a week. He said, oh, I was playing golf yesterday with one of the owners of the Newark paper. I could have gotten him a job for $70 a week, plus to make him an editor. And my mother said, gee, I'm sorry, I didn't think of calling you. You were playing golf with one of the scutters? Yeah, oh, no. He said, with a new house. My mother said, that's the Star Ledger. I would never want my son to work for the Star Ledger. They're going to die soon. And that was it. A quick comment about what Doug said about covering the African American programs in the community. Obviously, someone found out that I was the only member of the staff who graduated from a separate but equal high school in Newark many years ago. And I somehow ended up covering all these functions when no one else was available. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., and he was quite a gentleman. I also did the first stories on the Paynes brothers and also on Harold Gibson. But as I say, someone on the night desk apparently found out that I'd gone to a separate but equal high school, and therefore I filled in for Doug on some of these occasions.
My name is David Berliner, and it's fitting that I follow Hyde because I followed him as night police reporter. Feel free to use this noise. Tell the truth. I thought I had a pretty loud voice. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
No.
Anyway, I was saying that I followed Hyde as night police reporter, and it was a big break for me actually because it was 1967 and the riots broke out, and so I did the lead stories, and it was fun. But the most fun I had was driving around at night with Jim Lowney and a couple of the other photographers. But Jim and I had sort of like a special bond, and we would go to accidents. One particular night we went to an accident, a horrible accident, which was the best for him. And a car crashed on overhead, went over the side, people on the ground killed. Jim took the picture. He said, okay, I got it for the night. And we had these police radios. And we always listened to the police radio, got our adrenaline going and everything. And there was something up in the turnpike, so we drove up to the turnpike to one of the toll booths, and an 18-wheeler, a tractor trailer, had driven through the toll booth and come to a rest about 100 feet past that. And there were these two cement wheels on the front of the trailer when they set it down. And not to get too graphic, but one of them was in the middle of the toll collector's chest. And he was lying there alive, in shock. And Jim took some discreet pictures. But the thing that really brought me to realize what life's all about, in many ways, is it was raining, and the firemen and the policemen and the emergency folks were standing there drinking coffee, having donuts, and, you know, kidding around while this guy was lying there. And I talked to somebody and I said, is this what it's all about? And he said, you got to get used to it, because if you start investing yourself in every one of these things, you're going to have a nervous breakdown. And it served me very well, because there were a lot of people, Bill, talking about Vietnam, coming from Vietnam. There were many of us who were in Newark, the night and day side, who experienced Vietnam in a special way, because the Newark News, as many of you recall, used to have a story on every single person who was killed in Vietnam, an individual story. And we had to go out, get to the family, knock on the door. Often, a couple of times, unfortunately, I knocked on the door before the family knew. And then get a story. And the worst part was you had to get a picture. Not take a picture, you had to get one from the family. And I just remember the times that I'd go in and I'd look for a picture, I'd ask for a picture, and I'd get a picture and I'd say, yeah, it's not too. You have another one? And I'd take another one. How about another angle? I wound up taking every picture so the ledger couldn't get it. You know, I come into the city room, you know, with like this whole pile. There are a few things that were mentioned, and I just want to touch on them because they reminded me of things. As far as the ledger, which somebody characterized in the same way I would have at the time, I remember we were all so disgusted with the ledger because so many of us would see our stories that ran in the late editions of the news the next morning on the front page of the ledger with somebody else's lead, somebody else's byline, and from the second graph on, it was our story. So one day, I don't know who did it, somebody took the stock tables. We were sure that the ledger was copying, photostating or whatever they were doing, our stock tables, and put in a little line the size of the type that showed what the stock companies were, and it said, "This table stolen from the Newark News." And the next morning, lo and behold, we got the paper, we looked at it, there it was.
Wow.
So, unfortunately, it didn't help us, but we all felt a little bit better. How many of you were talking about the New York Times? I think one of the most rewarding days for us was in, what was the 65 blackout? When the Times had to come over and print at the Newark News. And so you had the New York Times with all our typeface on the front. It sort of looked like the Newark News with the New York Times on the top. And I think that was very humbling for them, but they got over it. I just want to say I lived in New York, and I came to the news. I first started on the weekly paper in Orange, the Orange Transcript, and I commuted 2 hours every day, each way. And my goal was to get on the Newark News, even though I lived in New York. The Newark News was it. And I worked for 9 months on the weekly paper, and then Al DePoto called me up and said, "We got to get you over here." I went over there. I worked in Elizabeth for a year at night, and then got called up to night city job. And I can't tell you how proud I was, and how awed I was to see these guys and other guys who are here and who have passed. They were names to me. They were bylines to me. They were. It just made me feel excited. I was just thrilled, and I never lost that thrill. The same way I've never lost the thrill of hearing the sound of the teletype, which to me was newspapering. And in fact, I don't know if any of you remember an editor named Goldie. And I'd be in the Elizabeth office at night, And I go to cover a story in Linden where they had this mayor who was insane. And it was a show, and so hundreds of people would come to the city council meeting. And usually the city council meetings anywhere else in the state were kind of boring. This was never boring because he used to come in with a t-shirt sometimes. He had yelling, shouting, the fights, all these things were going on. So I would come back with 4 or 5 great stories. And I'd sit down and I'd take my notes and I'd sit down and teletype and doing that. And after the first story, I type end and get ready for my second one. And I'd get the phone would ring. Berliner! Yes? This is Goldie. Yeah. Haven't you written enough of this shit? And I would get that like in worse terms with each succeeding story.
This is what we want to do is get 2 more. I'm going to cut you off.
Okay, this is
one last thing, and then get 2 more. And then we're
okay. Yeah. I did. Just one more thing I have here is you're talking about Harry Anderson and other people, and one of the great lessons I learned is if you wanted to get a yes, no matter what it was, do it before lunch, because after lunch you had no chance and you probably would get yelled out of the building. Thank you.
We were hoping that we might use the last few minutes before 8 o'clock, have John Cunningham share his thoughts with us. As you all know, John was not only at the Newark News, but has become a distinguished historian of the state in terms of so many things that have happened here. In academia, we always have a panel and then we have somebody summing up. And I'm wondering if, John, if you would share some thoughts with us and perhaps give a final blessing to this evening.
You want me to give the benediction?
Well, that's right.
I am one of the few guys who quit the Newark News. The rest just hung on and fell down. But I led the news in 1963. But in 1973, when I got word that the Newark News had folded, I wept because it had meant so much to me over 23 years of age. I went there as a kid who knew practically nothing. I was underpaid for 23 years, but I could stand it because I worked for easily the best newspaper in the country. We were not permitted any leeway. We weren't permitted any lies. We weren't permitted any gravy from anybody. I once got a tie from my mother for writing a story about her daughter who had traveled through Europe camping on her honeymoon. Lloyd finally heard about it and he said, "Give it back." I couldn't find it, by the way, and it didn't fit anyway. But it proved to me that nothing erroneous went by. I don't know that any of us who worked at the Newark News could have been anything other than deeply proud for the privilege. I felt when I went to the Newark News from the Morristown Record that I had been promoted not quite to heaven, but I was at least on the road there. In short, what I am, the Newark News produced. Thank you.
I'm going to turn the microphone back to our host.
67 years ago, that's in the Morristown Record, when we founded the New Jersey Newswriters Association.
Buddy, I want to thank you too. Bill McRae, who's the director of the
Great to see you.
I lost track. Where you been? You went to the Times, right?
I worked for the Times, yeah. No, I left years ago. I'm actually spending a year starting Friday at Rutgers Fellowship. But I'm going to give you my card. Give me a call. And maybe
Is your email?
Yeah, my email's up there. Yeah, that would be great.
Not much, but I live in Princeton. Oh, you do? Okay. I'm retired.
Okay. You know, I did a PhD at Princeton in the 70s.
I just want to remind you that there's a little bit more food and drink, which should encourage more conversation. We have copies. Doug was very kind to go to the effort to reprint his article, his history of the Newark Evening News. Please come up and pick up a copy. We have, I think, 3 or 4 copies of Jerry's new book available, plus flyers for those who want to order it. And I just want to close by thanking you all for coming. This was a great event. Do wander down also to the table at the far end. George Hawley, who's now the supervising librarian for the New Jersey Information Center here at the Newark Public Library, has made a number of photographs of the clipping files, of the indexes. So if you're curious about how the morgue is being cared for today here at the library, you'll get a hint of it at that table down there. So thank you again.